Well, I'm glad you asked that. The reason I wrote this paper is that I'm very interested in the notion of consensus in science. And to me, there is some kind of maybe a trade war or something going on against some of the big oil companies. And one of them is Exxon. And I'm not defending any industry, I'm not paid by any industry like that. I'm interested in how public opinion is being swayed. So I saw this paper by Supran and Oreskes, and it was written in 2017, and they were examining internal documents from Exxon versus the public statements that Exxon had made over a period of time about climate change and climate science. So my background is in advertising, so I thought, well, let's have a look at this. It's kind of odd to me that a climate scientist is reviewing advertising, but who knows? So I started looking at it, and I ended up writing a paper on it that puts together both like a timeline of various things that were happening in the market at the time, as well as some of the consensus material that was being presented in the public. One of the things I find quite interesting is that as temperatures rose and then flatlined from about 1998 forward, and carbon dioxide was still going up quite dramatically, you see also a divergence in the climate models or simulations, where the simulations are going up predicting very high temperatures. Temperatures are flatlining, and yet many consensus papers are coming out saying, no, there's a consensus that we're warming, when it was actually flatlining. So that's all part of this as well. So I'm referring to the Supran and Oreskes paper. I called my own paper The Merchants of Consensus, a public battle against Exxon. And I found in the Supran and Oreskes paper that, that the number of documents they assessed was quite small, about 187 documents from Exxon internally. Now, Exxon is a huge company. It's a multinational company. They have something like 70,000 employees. And the documents they selected were from 1977 to 2014. So, almost a 40-year span. 187 documents, though, it's not very many, especially in a company that big. And they also looked at a number of full-page ads that were run in the New York Times as advertorials. They tried to make the case that these ads were misleading or that they had intentionally misled the public. And having worked in advertising, I know that if you're a big ad agency and you have a big client and you have the U.S. Fair Trade Act, you're not going to be lying in the New York Times in a big ad. You're just not going to be getting away with it because it's a regulated industry. So these were some of the reasons why I looked at the paper and why I wrote my own paper. And the premise that they worked upon was how far had the Exxon ads strayed from the 4 key points of understanding about anthropogenic global warming or human-caused global warming. And they said that it's real, that it is human-caused, that it is serious, and that it is solvable. Now, when we look at the definitions of climate change, we find that there's actually 2 definitions. One of them is the political definition, which is done by the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And this was established way back like 1992 in the Rio Convention that occurred in Rio de Janeiro. And the interesting thing is that this is a definition that refers to the stabilization of greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere at a level that would prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. So that's the political definition. But the scientific definition by the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, this refers to a change in the state of the climate that can be identified by statistical tests and that would typically last for decades or longer. And climate change may be due to natural internal processes or external forcings such as modulation of solar cycles, volcanic eruptions, or anthropogenic changes in the composition of atmosphere or land use. So they're acknowledging that it could be nature or human influenced or both. And they say nothing about danger. if we refer back to the 4 key points of understanding about anthropogenic global warming, and we cross-reference them to the 2 definitions, we find that there isn't a consistent match. We find that the fact that it's serious and solvable actually do not exist in the scientific definition. So Roger Pielke Jr. wrote a very interesting paper in 2005, and his paper was called Misdefining Climate Change. And in it, he points out that these 2 different definitions lead to 2 different paths of action. For one path of action, for the political definition, you must go and assess the energy system and try and change the energy system, move off fossil fuels and decarbonize. If you look at the scientific definition, you must adapt because there are factors that are going to change no matter what. And one of the key points that he makes is that climate risk and danger are subjective things. Like if there's a floodplain and no one lives on it, no one builds a factory there, then there's no risk and there's no danger. But if there's a floodplain and you build a multi-billion-dollar beautiful city like Calgary on it, there's a risk and a danger because we've known since 1933 there were 8 of the worst floods in Calgary prior to 1933. So this is something that we've known about for a long time, and yet we keep building on a floodplain. So yes, this creates risk, it creates danger. Let's go back to Supran and Oresky's paper and the methodological issues. There were only 187 documents. They were produced over the course of 37 years from a company of 70,000 people. So this is not statistically representative of a company. And they did a different kind of assessment based on the methodology used, and they found that yes, indeed, the paper was flawed. Part of the method that failed them was the same method that Oresky's had used in her first consensus study that happened in around 2004. And that paper was reviewed by Dr. Benny Pizer, and he found that even though she claimed there was almost 100% consensus on anthropogenic global warming, in fact, he found that most of the papers had only mentioned global warming in their abstract, but within the content, there was nothing more about it. They were not affirming or denying anthropogenic influence. They simply mentioned the term. So this is the same kind of methodological problem applied to the paper by Supran and Oresky's. In that consensus survey, almost half of those papers had no position at all on anthropogenic global warming. They just mentioned the term. So, history is one of my favorite things, and one of the things I find in history is you have to set a context. And when you set a context, then you build a timeline. And once you start to build that timeline, you see a number of interesting things happening. And I really found that in this research. In fact, it was so enlightening to me because I found that there were many market factors that would have affected what was going on in that time. And this is probably why we are at the point today where it seems the financial community is going one way on climate change, and the scientific community is going exactly the opposite direction. So that's more or less what the paper is about. Now, one of the things that I did is I correlated temperature, the Exxon statements, and the consensus studies all in one big graph. So I think, if we have a look at that, and have a look at how I presented it to a group recently here in Alberta. I think people will find it quite interesting. I know I did. And didn't actually read the whole document. And Benny Pizer, some years later, reviewed her work, and he found that actually, when you read the whole document, most of the people just mentioned global climate change. They didn't actually say anything about it, and they did not agree with it. So almost half of the papers she cited as agreeing with climate change didn't even do anything more than refer to it. So 2004 was when Oresky's wrote her consensus paper. And I started saying to myself, because I like history, let's look at the context of history. And you may be familiar with this graph from the background graph from some of the things that Grassroots Alberta has sent around. So the background graph is from Dr. John Christie. This is a correlation of a number of models. The red line is the average of all these climate models, which are computer simulations. And they all, as you can see, forecast, wow, it's going to get really hot. On the bottom line, Dr. Christie and his group study satellite data, and they compared it with weather balloon data. And you can see that there was some warming, and then there's a divergence that happens between the models predicting really hot temperatures and temperatures kind of flatlining. So I started looking at this graph and said, wow, what happens if we take the statements from Exxon and we apply them to the dates that Exxon published them in the paper, or the statements that were written in documents internally, and see what happens in that comparison? You know, is it realistic that people would be saying those things at that time? So all the Exxon items are in the blue boxes, and you find that basically the comments from the Exxon people, they're just saying, well, you know, it's quite ambiguous about what's happening with climate, and we can't see that there's a direct forecast that we can rely on. And we think there should be more research, and this is a policy issue, we should be careful. So they're making public statements in the press, and you've seen some of the ads on the table, but they're not telling people, buy our oil. And they're not telling people we should always use oil forever because what a great idea and there's no problem ever. They're just saying there's a problem here. And you'll find that right after they said those things, suddenly in the green boxes, all these consensus surveys start coming out. And look at the number of consensus surveys that there are as the temperature and the models diverge. So it's like people are blind to the evidence. They're consistently saying, no, look, really, we all agree that it's getting warmer. Well, it's not statistically significant, this warming. And it's not in correlation with the amount of CO2 that's being put out. So, so how can you actually say that Exxon has been misleading the public? Now, I want to say, I'm not here to defend Exxon. I'm just examining how the consensus story is manipulating public opinion. So we see here that Exxon is saying there should be directions for climate research. They're talking about policy needs, and that's something that we are very concerned with in Alberta. Look at the policy on coal phase out. You know, that's very detrimental to our economy. It's destroyed the lives of thousands of people. It's destroying 30 communities, costing us billions of dollars. We're now buying coal power from Montana. So, so they're making sensible statements here. They're thoughtful and science, what we know and don't know. They're trying to say, look, there are some ambiguities. We should not jump on this bandwagon. And that may be why the consensus surveys started coming out. Anyway, so here we have the unsettled science and tomorrow's energy needs. I would say that most of the problems we have right now in Canada regarding policy is that people are energy illiterate, especially young people. If you talk with them and ask them how we will power the future, most of them will say wind and solar. Wind and solar provide about 2% of the world's energy. So, and we just posted another blog yesterday from Robert Lyman saying that world oil demand has dramatically risen just in the past 3 months. So you can see these ads are fairly thoughtful, and let's see what the market response was. Exxon to the world, drop dead. So this is from Greenpeace. So now which of those ads do you think has more effect on the public? Which would you remember? Do you remember what Exxon said? And you barely remember the headline, right? This one you remember. So climate has become a modern day obsession, a public obsession. And why? You know, what other field of science demands the attention of the public and the media day in, day out?
Can you think of one? There's nothing. It's climate change all the time. It's a bandwagon. And you can see, again, going back to history, if you look here, around 2005, there's a sudden spike in the search for climate science. Now, why is that? So that's what I started looking at, following a timeline. So as I mentioned just now, you know, how influential were the Exxon ads? Well, if you look at advertising, corporate communications differ greatly from retail forms of advertising. Because first of all, you're not selling anything, you know, you're not selling a book or any other type of thing like that. So there's no product, and according to research, over 60% of advertisements of a half page or larger, and these are all full page ads in the New York Times, and over 80% of ads smaller than half a page are scanned out. That is, they're looked at for less than half a second, or less than a second. So Exxon spent all that money running these ads that were not influential, and yet Oreskes and Supran claim that somehow they completely misled the American public. Well, I found a very interesting article by Lawrence Solomon, old article. Oh, did I go too far? Oh, I'm here. Oh, sorry, I'll just stay here for a moment. There were market changes that were happening at that same time. This is where we have to stay. Market changes. Peter Drucker wrote a book in 1997, and in it he posited that in the near future, labor unions and institutional investors would own all of corporate America. And it sounded pretty fishy at the time, but that's pretty much what's happened. So pension funds, institutional investors, and union funds own most of corporate North America. They have trillions of dollars. So as the trend of globalization swept the world, sovereign wealth funds, that's like Norway has a sovereign wealth fund that's worth $1 trillion. And their mandate in Norway is to invest it everywhere but Norway. So they're invested all over the world. So just to give you a bit of an example there, you know, we keep hearing like, wow, look at that in Norway, you can have a Tesla for really cheap. And of course, Norway has a lot of hydropower. I think they're about 95% hydro-powered. So to have a hydropower backing up an EV, that's a great combo. But they also have $1 trillion, and they only have 5 million population. So they can do whatever they want, you know, and you get a car, and you get a car, right? They actually could do that if they wanted to. So that's one of the sovereign wealth funds. And there's others, like the Church of Sweden is one of the sovereign wealth funds. And they wrote in a collaborative letter to the Premier of Alberta saying, you know, we're part of this group of 120 sovereign wealth funds and institutional investors, and we think that you should have a carbon tax, you should phase out coal, you should put wind and solar on the grid. They basically said, we have $4.6 trillion, and here's our climate plan for you. This was written to the Premier on September the 8th, 2015, and you can find it online, and I can send it to you. So Church of Sweden is one of those groups. And in Church of Sweden's annual report, they have a guy on the cover who is flying on jet skis. In the background are all these wind turbines. And you have to say to yourself, well, who supplies the oil and gas and coal that makes your wind turbines? But inside their annual report, they say, we will never invest in oil sands, tar sands, because they're ethical, right? So they're here ethically putting 7,000 people out of work, destroying 30 communities, and holier than thou. Now you may wonder, how did this happen? Why are these foreign groups affecting our policies in this way? And that's what I started finding the more I followed the trail here. So Enron knew. People always say Exxon knew, but actually it was Enron. Enron knew because in that Lawrence Solomon article that I quoted, He went back to what's called the Palmisano Memo that was found after Enron collapsed. And Enron was very active in Kyoto. They saw it as a fantastic opportunity. They said the biggest money plays would be the rules governing emissions trading, the rules governing transfers of emission reduction rights between countries, and the rules governing a gargantuan clean energy fund. Any of that sound familiar? So Enron never died. It's been resuscitated. And in 1997, Enron had set up this little trust fund, and some of the mutual funds had invested in it, and some of those mutual funds were held by institutional investors. And because of all of the kind of complicated accounting that was going on there, they were actually getting returns of 13 to 24%. Now, most pension funds, as I understand it, want to get about a 7% return on investment. And I think they're even having trouble getting 4% right now. So you can imagine this windfall that would perk up everyone's attention, like, wow, how do we do more of this? So let's look at that timeline. What was happening in the world? So Kyoto was set up in 1997. In 2000, the European Climate Change Program was launched, and that was with the objective of avoiding dangerous climate change, right? Which is the UNFCCC definition. In 2003 in the US, the Chicago Carbon Exchange was set up by Al Gore and some others. And it started operation, it ran till 2010, but it never really took off. And so Mr. Gore moved his operations to the UK, and I don't know if that's why he did, but he did. And the European Emissions Trading System, the directive was established in 2003. Trading began in 2005. In 2002, a thing called the Carbon Disclosure Project was formed by a charitable nonprofit set up by the Rockefeller Philanthropic Advisors Group. So what is the CDP? Very interesting animal. The CDP, this was a game changer. Up to this time, usually industry had reported their GHG emissions or their pollution monitoring results only to governments. So it was pretty much anonymous because, you know, a government would calculate all of it and say, well, we in Alberta emit X, we in Canada emit X, but no one could actually pick on any particular company. So the CDP sends out questionnaires every year to cities and to corporations and says, will you voluntarily fill out this form and tell us your GHG footprint of the year? And then they say, and by the way, how many climate change events did you notice this year? So we have to differentiate between weather and climate change. Weather is things that happen now, that happen over a period of a week or month or within a season. Climate change is something that happens over 30, 50, 100, 1,000, 3,000 years. These are very long cycles for climate change, so you don't notice any climate change event this year. You may notice a weather event. So they're calculating all this material. They get these voluntary submissions. They give them to somebody like, I don't know, PricewaterhouseCoopers, or what's the other one? Accenture. Anyway, these big management accounting type firms, they aggregate all of the information and they come up with a report. And with that report, they say, oh, look at that. Apple has a clean green footprint. And look at that. The Alberta tar sands is filthy dirty. No one should invest in it. Right? So now they've started identifying individual companies, and they literally make a black and white list. The CDP is a charity that's situated in Wales and England, and it claims to be charitable, but that's not very charitable to us, is it? And they are a transnational organization. They're unelected, they're unaccountable, and they now have the largest database of GHG emissions in the world. and they publish it online. So that can be quite detrimental if you're a corporation, especially if you're one dealing in energy, because you're always going to have a dirty footprint. Unless, of course, someone gets you to buy a wind farm, then they kind of mark off some of that dirt, make you a little more green. So anyway, how big is the CDP? How influential? This is actually an old screenshot. But the CDP now has more than 827 institutional investors who are signed on. And those institutional investors hold $100 trillion in assets under management. So these are most of the major investors. There are a few corporations who are not signatory to the CDP, and they publish them as a non-reporting blacklist. So that was happening in 2002. That's when that began. So in 2002, the Exxon was putting out ads, and Greenpeace suddenly put out a huge campaign worldwide called Deception and Denial, a chronicle of Exxon's efforts to corrupt the debate. They had a whole campaign going, Stop ExxonMobil, and they were running around to different gas stations, and in Texas, I think they tried to put them up as climate criminals. So, you know, what's behind this? Like, who's funding Greenpeace? Well, no one really knows. What happened in 2003? Well, another group popped up. They're called BankTrack. And BankTrack is really a virulent organization. They really rabidly attack any bank that finances any resource. So I put kind of the lighter note here for Enbridge. The Enbridge Northern Gateway got their attention. But if you look online and read their material about the oil sands, they just shred it. They just rip it to shreds. So this group of, I think it's about 40 NGOs under BankTrack, what they do is they harass banks nonstop and tell them, you should not invest in coal, don't invest in oil, don't invest in oil sands, stop investing in natural gas. I don't know what they think we're all gonna run on, but this is going on all the time. And many other NGOs do these kind of similar campaigns. And in fact, at one point, Greenpeace did a campaign where they wrote personally to all of the corporate officers and directors of some of the biggest energy companies in the world, saying, you're all climate criminals, and we're going to make sure that you pay for this personally. You know, you may be prosecuted. So we wrote a letter back to all of those same people, at least the ones we could find, saying, well, this is where they're wrong, this is where they're wrong, this is where they're wrong. So we do our best. We're a small group, but we try to fight back wherever we can. So then what happened? Well, in 2004, Al Gore and David Blood set up Generation Investment Management. This is set up in the UK. And here you see an excerpt of Al Gore's movie where he's claiming that 100% of scientists agree on climate change, of 928 surveyed by Naomi Oreskes, who was the original author of the paper I first started talking about. And you can see Dr. Pizer did a review of Oreskes' consensus paper and found that about half of the people did not even make a statement about climate change or global warming. So let's see what else happened. Oh, and a note, who are the collaborators there with Al Gore's company? We have World Resources Institute. World Resources Institute is a very large organization, ENGO, and they set, I believe it's 3/4 of the GHG reduction targets for the Paris agreements. They worked with about 3/4 of the countries to set the targets. Do you think that's a conflict of interest at all? A little bit? Who else? They have Natural Resource Defense Council. These guys are in the States. They blocked Keystone. They blocked Energy East. They're attacking any kind of energy development in Canada. And I wonder why. And then we have the Climate Reality Project, which is Al's project, where he gets groups of people together like this, teaches them a climate PowerPoint and sends them off into the world as emissaries. And then they go to communities. And we were talking earlier about how conservatives or tax-concerned citizens could get the message out. We could follow that model. We don't have that money, but we could do it grassroots, literally. And the MISTA Foundation and Global Impact Investing Network, these are a story unto themselves. So going along in our timeline, we find that in 2005, another organization was set up called the United Nations Principles for Responsible Investment. And the UNPRI has these 6 principles, which are all about environment, social, and governance goals. This too is a voluntary organization, but once you sign on, you have to comply or explain. So it's a rather totalitarian view of what you should voluntarily do. And this group began with a bunch of institutional investors, and some of the leading Canadian institutional investors are part of it. And the whole idea was to mobilize money to save the planet on climate change. And most of the UNPRI signatories are also signatory to the CDP. So they work together. So what happened in 2005 is that actually a bunch of scientists had noticed that there was this divergence between the models going up and the temperatures flatlining. And so they started looking at the GHG radiative forcing theory. And they were saying, well, you know, maybe it's not the best metric to use anymore because it doesn't seem to represent what's going on. So this was a big report. Lots of very well-known scientists were part of it. You can find it online for free. You can read the whole thing if you want to read a lot of science. It's under the National Academies Press. But something happened right after that. Kyoto was signed into agreement. So what we see happening is that the financial community is moving along with the dangerous anthropogenic global warming theme, and the scientific community is separating and saying, wait a minute, we're not sure this works anymore. We don't think that radiative forcing is a thing. In 2006, Robert Carter, who's passed away recently, very nice guy, I did have the pleasure of meeting him once, he wrote an op-ed saying there's a problem. Global warming has stopped since 1998. But that was quickly forgotten. I wonder why. Because Al Gore's movie came out, scared the pants off everyone, and the year after that, he won a Nobel Prize. Pretty hard to argue with that with an op-ed. So now you can see kind of perhaps the power of communications and the influence that's being mobilized in the world. And these are things that are all publicly accessible. It's just that I don't think people have really put the dots together. So that's what I'm trying to do for you this evening. Now, how effective was this world of trading? This is from a Baker McKenzie PowerPoint that we found online. In 2007, they're explaining how you could trade carbon emissions through this thing called the United Nations Clean Device Mechanism, or Clean Development Mechanism, which was set up initially to help people fund wind and solar for the developing nations. But in fact, it actually funds all the Western nations that make those things, right? So how much money could you make? $1.2 billion in 23 minutes. So you can see that this is why people are very keen on this. And in 2007, a group of 13 billionaire philanthropies in the United States called Climate Works banded together, and they decided to change the world. They didn't ask anyone if they wanted the world changed. They just decided they would start funding local NGOs, and they funded lots of them in Canada. Lots and lots and lots. Pembina Institute comes to mind. They got more than $1 million from them. Vivian Krause has done a lot of work on those guys. Anyway, so they all got together. They did this report. I have a copy of it if you can't find it online. And There was David and Lucille Packard Foundation, Sea Change Foundation, William and Flora Hewlett, Doris Duke Charitable Foundation, Kresge's, McKnight, Oak Foundation, Energy Foundation, and they all banded together as Climate Works. Just so you know, in the United States in the 1950s, there was a RISI committee, and they investigated all of these big philanthropies because they said, wow, these guys have a lot of power. They have too much power. And there's a book on that called Foundations by Renee A. Wormser. And they were right. They have a lot of power. So, so you'd think that now maybe they've made some big investments in clean tech and wind and solar, and things are going good. Like maybe we should go into wind and solar. Maybe we should go into clean tech. I mean, obviously, if there's such a big financial push for it, it should be a winner, right? I mean, these are all financial people. But in 2013, in the Wall Street Journal, this man, Joseph Deere, who used to be the chief investment officer of CalPERS, that's the California Pension Retirement System Fund, which is the 6th largest pension fund in the world, he said to the Wall Street Journal that clean tech is a noble way to lose money. It's an L for loser investment, and that they had 9.7% annualized losses on their $500 million fund for the past about decade. So he said the solution is to either raise the price of carbon or lower the cost of the alternatives. And what do we hear today? We hear, oh, we must put a price on carbon. It should be this much today and that much tomorrow. And look, the price of solar and wind has gone down so much. It's a fabulous thing to do. None of which is true, of course, because it's not the front end of wind and solar that costs the money. It's the back end. It's the natural gas plant that makes the power grid work when wind and solar are busy generating renewable energy certificates that you can trade, like that $1.2 billion trade we just saw. So in 2013, the Interpol issued a guide to carbon trading crime, because the problem with carbon dioxide in this trading environment is that it's not a thing. Like, if you're trading in pork bellies or barley or beef or whatever, someday someone theoretically could drive up and say, here they are, right? That's not going to happen with carbon dioxide, because it's just numbers on paper. It's just air, hot air. In fact, Mark Shapiro wrote in a paper in Harper's in 2010, he wrote a great statement that said, carbon trading is the lack of delivery of an invisible substance to no one. But people are making money on it. And in 2013, the IPCC came out with this report, the AR5 report, and in it they said, wow, for the past 15 years there's been no warming, no statistically significant warming, and not one of our 20 models, of which we have hundreds of runs, predicted this. So there's something wrong with the models, and we're not too sure about global warming either. But this was published in one chapter, a very little piece. You would think if people thought there was no crisis, it would be on the front cover, that people would be saying, this is fantastic. Look at that. We're not at risk like we thought we were. There might still be some warming, but it doesn't look as bad as we thought. Great. No, it was kind of like, well, yeah, this happened, but let's put it in chapter 9 and just one little sidebar. So you can see at the top here, this is a graph of, it only goes up to 2015, but I'm not trying to hide anything. That's just as much as I had on the graph. You can see that the bottom lines that are all colored, these are temperatures from 5 different data sets. And they're all like pretty close together, some variance. And they all go up along with the CO2 line, which is at the top, the blue squiggly line. So there's some correlation there. You could say, yeah, it looks like CO2 causes warming. Yeah, it looks like it. But when you get to about 2002, again, we see that same kind of divergence that we saw with the models and the real temperatures. It flatlines. So you can see the trend line is pretty flat. And in one of the interviews we have with Dr. Ross McKittrick, who's an economist from the University of Guelph, He said that the separation that we saw earlier on the models and temperature graph is big enough now that it likely would never be, the temperature would never catch up with the models in the short term.
In response to the IPCC AR5, Dr. Judith Curry testified that it weakened the case for human factors dominating climate change. She said there was a growing appreciation for the importance of natural climate variability, and that there was little evidence that supported an increase in extreme weather events attributed to human causation.
And so we have a parting of the ways. We have science going in one direction with data and evidence, and we have the financial institutes of this nation and the world going in the opposite direction and desperately trying to maintain that. So here we have a desperate scenario. Mark Carney, the governor of the Bank of England, formerly governor of the Bank of Canada, formerly an employee of Goldman Sachs, telling the Lloyds of London in 2015, just before the Paris Accord, that there's a tragedy of the horizon. And he cited all these different pieces of evidence about more storms and more losses, more insurance losses, lots more floods, everything's bad, wow, terrible, wildfires, all the usual Book of Revelations things we hear from Al Gore. But this fellow, Steve Kopetz, who's an analyst in the States, went through Mark Carney's speech, and he cross-referenced all of his claims against U.S. government data and found that pretty much everything he said was wrong. And he said, as an analyst, I find Mr. Carney's speech is truly dismaying. For the governor of the bank to claim that climate change is leading to rapidly rising insurance claims is at best a critical failure of analysis. As discussed above, insurance claims are a function of a number of factors, including the type and country of the weather event, as well as the extent of insurance coverage and payouts.
And so as we move forward from that time frame into 2015, we find the Paris Agreement was implemented in December of 2015, and France issued a unilateral directive that all of its foreign investments should ensure consistency of guidance with the French framework of a 2 C investment initiative. This would seem to be in conflict with the WTO, but France does have 2 trillion euros of assets under management and 500 billion US invested outside of Europe. So that's fairly significant. And France, we have no oil, we have ideas. So I guess that's one of their ideas. And when we move into 2018, we find we can return to Roger Pielke Jr.'s discussion that opened this video, that climate change, in light of the current scientific evidence, it is evident that human GHG emissions are not the main driver of climate change, as Judith Curry has pointed out. And according to Roger Pielke Jr.'s paper, he said, under the UNFCCC definition, without the detection and attribution of human causation, there is no reason to act, as there would be no evidence of climate change under its narrow definition. But as I've shown you today, of course, Enron lives. It's been resuscitated. Again, we see that the financial markets and institutional investors are looking for the biggest money plays, the rules governing emissions trading, the rules governing transfers of emissions reduction rates between countries, and the rules governing a gargantuan clean energy fund. And as noted in the Lawrence Solomon article, Enron now has excellent credentials with many green interests, including Greenpeace, World Wildlife Fund, NRDC, German Watch, the U.S. Climate Action Network, the European Climate Action Network, Ozone Action, World Resources Institute, and World Watch. And this position, as he said then, should be increasingly cultivated and capitalized on, monetized. And that's from the Palmisano Enron memo. And as for Exxon, let's look once again at these ads. Here's an example of one of Exxon's New York Times ads, what we can say is Enron actually knew. It's not that Exxon knew, Enron knew. Because if you look at the Greenpeace ad beside the Exxon ad, which one will you remember? And lastly, of course, our view is that the sun is the main driver of climate change, and there are diverse opinions among many different climate scientists in different disciplines. But let's look at what Dr. Judith Curry said in her U.S. testimony regarding the IPCC AR5 report. She said that motivated by the precautionary principle to avoid dangerous anthropogenic climate change, attempts to modify the climate through reducing CO2 emissions may actually turn out to be futile. And why? Solar variability, volcanic eruptions, and natural internal climate variability will continue to be sources of unpredictable climate surprises. And this is why Roger Pielke's definitions issue is so important, because we must be willing and able to adapt to these unpredictable surprises. And in closing, to my pleasure, I find that there is a new paper that's come out also critiquing Supran and Oreskes for their methodology, taking a slightly different tactic than I did, but finding a very similar outcome, that their paper was flawed. So thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to present. I'm Michelle Sterling for Friends of Science Society.